Hello, Earth Science students. Today I'm going to be taking a look at the Unit 4 material and the information that you need to be successful on the Unit 4 end of unit assessments. So let's just briefly go over what our goals were. Unit 4 looks at the fossil record and the geologic timescale, so looking at the history of Earth. We started by defining the word uniformitarianism. Remember, that's a really big word. It just has to do with the way that Earth processes. Things like volcanic eruptions, plate tectonics, happen in the same way today that they happened billions of years ago. So these processes are uniform, or they stay the same. So the observations that we make about plate tectonics now can help us understand the way that plate tectonics caused the continents and the geologic features on our Earth to form in the past. Uniformitarianism. We use this theory while we discuss Earth's geologic history because it helps us understand how the Earth formed in the way that it did. The geologic time scale is not divided into hours, minutes, centuries, those kind of set divisions of time that we're used to, maybe when you look at your watch. But the geologic time scale helps us understand how major biological events correspond to Earth's geologic history. So as there were changes to the position of the continents and maybe Earth's climate, we also see changes in the fossil record. We see mass extinctions and we see new organisms evolve and we see kind of flourishing of that. We'll take a look at that in more detail in just a moment. We looked in this unit at how the rock record of an area is interpreted. We looked at different fossil dating techniques, rock dating techniques. We'll explore that in some detail. Relative and absolute dating are two methods that a geologist would use to determine the geologic history of an area. And we also looked at how fossils can help us understand the past. So let's go through kind of the major points that you'll be asked about on the test and the major points that I want you to feel comfortable with to be successful in this unit. So the first would be radioactive dating. It's one of the first ways that we can determine the absolute age of a rock. So we need to say, well, what is absolute dating? What is relative dating? How are these pieces of information used to understand rocks and fossils? Relative dating just uses information about the position of rock layers and compares them to others. Fossils that are found within those can also be used to help determine the relative age of a rock, so comparative age. The younger things we would expect to find above the older materials. Obviously, as plate tectonics are working, some of these layers get shifted, but we can use fossils that are embedded in the rocks to help us understand older versus younger. Absolute dating, on the other hand, sometimes is called radiometric dating or radioactive dating, uses data from radioactive elements that are found within the rocks or found within the fossils. So take a small sample, analyze the radioactive content, and they can determine a numerical age of different parts or particles that are being tested. Radioactive dating relies on radioactive decay. So material is most radioactive at one point, and after different units of time, half of that material will decay away as that material goes through the radioactive decay process. So we accomplish this. Relative dating compares younger versus older, whereas absolute dating gives more of a specific time range. Studying rocks in layers helps put a perspective on the time period being studied. So if you're looking at a section of rock and you find a fossil that is buried deeper than another section, you know that fossil must be older than the things that came above it. Let's go to talk about fossils in a little bit more detail. How do fossils form, and what are some features that make a good fossil? If organisms are very small, they are easier to preserve and they can usually be buried more quickly. So a quick burial, small organisms, if there are a lot of them, it's more likely that something will be trapped and will become a fossil. So these are things that make good fossils. If you are studying climate change, if you look for fossils that were really sensitive to temperature changes, that might give you an indication that that organism got fossilized at a time when Earth either heated up or cooled down significantly, and that might have caused that organism to die off. So fossils can give us an indication both of what the climate looked like at the time. It can give us an indication of what types of organisms lived in a specific area, and it can also tell us about the environment. We used ferns as an example. We say ferns like to grow in kind of more moist, warm environments. So if you find a rock with a fern fossil in it, or a fossilized imprint of a fern, you would know that in the past, at one time, the environment where that rock was must have been a climate that accommodated that type of plant life. Let's look down at some of the other goals. Talked about fast burial and hard body parts. If you find an imprint of an organism, a fern is the one I mentioned before, but something like a dinosaur footprint, and you don't see the actual bones, well, maybe the bones decayed, maybe something came and ate those, or a decomposer broke them down. But the fact that you have the imprint there tells you that that organism must have existed in that environment at some point in time. It doesn't really tell you much more information. It doesn't tell you about the population size. It doesn't tell you about the food that the organism ate, but just tells you that it's there. And sometimes we have to take different pieces of information and put it together to help us develop a full story about the history of an area. When we find a fossil, we can tell about the environment in which it lived by examining other aspects of the rock layer that are around it. And the fossil record sometimes continues across continents. So sometimes we can find a fossil in South America and a fossil in Africa, even though those continents are very far apart now. It tells us that at some point in time, those continents were probably close together. It's not that the organism swam across the ocean. It's not that, people were transporting the fossils and kind of reburying them in a new place, but instead that at one point in time when those continents were connected, that the fossils or that the organisms lived there and were fossilized, and then the continents drifted apart. Remember, the Earth is very old. We're talking 4.6 billion years old. So a lot of things have moved, a lot of things have shifted. A lot of living creatures have gone extinct. So things that lived in past Earth environments, they don't exist anymore, but their fossils exist. And so when we dig those fossils up, we can learn a lot about where those organisms, what it was like when those organisms were alive. The early Earth was very different from the Earth today. It was very hot. There was a lot of volcanic activity, lots of storms. Because there was so much volcanic activity, we made lots of igneous rocks, or the Earth created lots of igneous rocks. Igneous rocks come from the eruption of magma and lava to the surface of the Earth, and the cooling of that magma and lava. And so we would expect, if you find lots of igneous rocks, that they were formed when there was a lot of volcanic activity. It doesn't mean that volcanoes don't still erupt. We know that they do. We get new igneous rocks when that happens, but lots of the igneous rocks on our Earth formed when that intense volcanic activity was taking place in Earth's early days. I mentioned trilobites. Let's go and take a look at a kind of diagram of the geologic timescale. Trilobites are these tiny little creatures. They're one of the first living creature fossils that we have, so they are extinct now. They're small. They kind of look like horseshoe crabs, but tiny versions of them, and they lived in the water, and there are lots of them in these really old fossils from this Cambrian period. So speaking of periods, we have the geologic timescale divided into 4 main sections. We have eons, eras, periods, and epochs. The eras are shown here, kind of in the column on the left, and they can be broken down into smaller segments, which are known as periods. The division between one period and the next, or between one era and the next, exist not because so much time passed by, but because we see different groups of organisms in existence. I'm going to move to just a different diagram that kind of shows that a little bit better. So here we see that Cambrian, and up at the top, period, and we have eras. The same eras that were in the columns are over on the left. The Cambrian period is when we see the first fish and the first chordates. Chordates are organisms that have a spinal cord. As we move up further, we have, this Permian period had a major extinction, but then after that we started to see the first dinosaurs and the first mammals appear. So the divisions of the geologic timescale take place when organisms die off or when new organisms evolve. So biological events are what drive the division of these eras, not set units of time. Okay, let's take a look back here. Mass extinctions. So we see mass extinctions during periods when lots of organisms sort of disappear from the fossil record. So if we were to be kind of digging through an archaeological site, and all the layers of rock that were younger didn't have a certain group of organisms, but when you dig down a little bit deeper, now you see a bigger diversity in organisms. Well, something happened at some point in time where all of those organisms, like you see down here, stopped living. They went extinct. They stopped existing. And so that kind of line that we could create in the rock layers, we would call a period of mass extinction. So lots of different organisms. Maybe the climate changed. Maybe the plates, had shifted enough where the organisms couldn't survive in their new area. Maybe at the new position they were at, they just didn't get the same amount of resources, and their environment changed and they weren't able to survive. So those things are what we call mass extinctions. Let me jump back to our main concepts. The last is just like I was talking about, the geologic timescale being broken down into those divisions. I wanted to go back here and point to a few of them. The Hadean eon, so eons are the largest division, and then we were kind of focusing on eras and periods, and then epochs and ages. But the Hadean eon is sort of from the very beginning, when Earth's first formed until about 4 billion years ago. It's called the Hadean eon because that's where all of that major volcanic activity, lots of storms, lots of hotness was taking place because Earth was just coming together. And so that event involved a lot of heat. And so this is known as the Hadean eon. The Archean eon is where the first forms of life started to exist about 4 billion years ago. These were single-cell organisms, and they had to be really specialized to live in the extreme environment because Earth was still cooling down and was quite hot at that time. In the Proterozoic eon, we still get more diversification of those single-celled organisms, but it's the Phanerozoic eon where we see, and that's where things are today, where we see this huge diversity of life. We don't just see organisms living in the water. Organisms start to live on land. Organisms start to fly. We see organisms like mammals, which are different from birds and are different from reptiles, different from amphibians. So all of that sort of diversity was evolved in the Phanerozoic eon. So that's where lots of different life forms exist. That eon contains the Paleozoic era, the Mesozoic era, and the Cenozoic era. Those are the time periods where the time period where we exist now. Let's jump back down and make sure that we met all of our goals for Unit 4. I think that we talked through everything. If you have questions or would like help with any of the items as you take that Unit 4 test, please let me know, reach out, and keep up the great work. Thanks, everyone.